All right, friends, welcome back. It's time to continue our journey in Lightroom. In this episode, we will be examining the images that we shot at the Small Pavilion where Ashley was sitting in the metal chair. We'll start off in the library to organize our files, and then we'll move into the development module to utilize Lightroom's powerful raw editing capabilities. So let's get started. All right, friends, welcome back into Lightroom. For this episode, we will be focusing on Ashley and the metal chairs. Now, if you've been watching these lessons in order, you've probably already seen Ashley in the yellow dress. In that episode, we did a very long-form, in-depth review of Lightroom. I went through, showed you how all the tools work, how all the modules work, and that was meant to be more of an introductory course. In this case, we're not going to deep dive and go super in-depth about how every single tool works. I really just want to step into the workflow, step on the gas, and get moving. So if you missed that episode and you want more of an introduction into Lightroom, please go back and watch Lightroom, Ashley, and the yellow dress. Furthermore, if you are an absolute beginner and you have never used Lightroom, in that case, I encourage you to go out to our website and check out our free tutorials. We have a beginner's guide to Lightroom that has a very comprehensive overview on how to use this software. Like I say, for this particular episode, we're going to step on the gas and get right into the workflow. Speaking of which, let's get started. If we look over here on the left, we can see I have already created a new collection, Ashley Chair First Cut. So I've gone through our primary library of images and whittled these images down from about 100 to our 21 top picks. You can see we've got a little bit of a wardrobe change right here down the middle. And in the beginning, Ashley is basically wearing this black jacket. So 21 images is a really good start. This is going to give us a lot of variety to choose our absolute final cuts from. And so what I want to do now is actually create another collection. And we're just going to call this Ashley Chair Final Cut. We'll not include selected photos just now because I don't want it dumping any random pictures in there. And I'll create that folder. So we now have an empty folder that says Ashley Chair Final Cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop into our first cut folder right here, and we're going to go through and start selecting out images that we really like, that we really want to put into our final image selection. So I'm just going to use the arrow keys on the keyboard to toggle through these images. So here's kind of a quick look at our first selection. And like I say, we have some really good materials to work with. It's going to be hard to choose our final cuts because they're all so good, but we'll do our best. So let's pop up here into our first image and try to make some evaluations. I do like this image. I think it actually is a pretty great start. It's got a nice kind of simple, I don't know, call it a smolder look to it. Ashley is kind of looking very sultry, but she's definitely making a good, strong connection with the viewer. So I like this image, and I'm going to add this to our quick collection. I'm going to hit the B key, and we immediately add this to our quick collection. So moving right along, we've got kind of the same image, only this one has a bit of a subtle smile. This one has a full-blown smile. And then we've started to change things up a little bit. I do like this because it's a different perspective. She's not paying attention to the camera. We've caught a very candid moment. I have two images like this. This one looks a little bit more spiritual, almost like she's in prayer. So between these two, I think I would probably keep both of them, but just for the purpose of this tutorial, I'll keep the one that looks a little bit more like a prayer, just because it's kind of a unique image. I really like the way that it kind of came out. All right, moving right along. Okay, once again, she's looked back into the camera. She's made a really strong connection with the viewer. Her hair is just kind of raining down on one side. It looks beautiful. It's being kissed by a little bit of side light. I think this is a very strong image, and I'm going to keep this one for sure. Moving right along. This one is similar, as you can see, very similar. She's kind of tucked into her hands a little bit more. I feel like I like this one better, so we're going to keep our original cut with that one, and we'll skip past this one. All right, and here, again, same kind of thing, only now she's smiling, so we've got an engaging smile. I do want to pick at least one really great engaging smile image out of this selection, but for now, let's move right along. These two images are almost completely identical, and then here she's kind of really engaging a little bit more. This one's kind of flirty, kind of fun. I'll go ahead and just keep this one out of those. All right, now we've gone back to pretty much the same expression, only this one's got a little bit more of a smolder to it. Moving right along, and we've changed our positions around a little bit. Now in this case, the audience isn't entirely aware that she's sitting in a chair, so her hands are kind of floating up here in no man's land, and I don't know that it's abundantly apparent to the viewer that she is in fact sitting backwards in a chair. maybe that's thinking a little bit too far into it. I do like the image. It's got a nice connection to the viewer. Both of her eyes have these beautiful catch lights in them. But let's move along and see what else we've got. Again, this one has kind of a lot more confidence than the previous one. I'm going to go ahead and stick with confidence, so we'll click the B key and add that one to our final cuts. As we move along, Ashley has kind of moved over in a different direction. Her face is pointing in a different direction than all the rest of the other files. That makes this file stand out a little bit. And she does have kind of a good, fun, flirty, engaging connection to the viewer, so we'll keep that one as well. All right, we've done a little bit of a wardrobe change. Here's a nice classic smiling pic. Let's look through these before we really decide what we're gonna do. And okay, back to this first one. All right, so the first one is okay. I can tell that she's got kind of some flyaway hairs coming in here. That's gonna take a little extra work cleaning those up in Photoshop. And if we have other images that will kind of do the job, I think I would rather move on with that. This one might be a little bit too smoldery. I don't know that we need to have this much of a sultry look to our outdoor photo shoot. This one is actually really nice. She makes a nice simple connection. It's a very, very simple portrait. I like that, so I'm gonna keep that one. Moving right along, these two are almost identical, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna zoom in and let's make sure that both of these are in fact nice and sharp. Now we've got our embedded preview button right here because we are in library mode. Again, this is just a facsimile of the file. Lightroom is generating a quick and dirty image. This is not the actual pixel data. So if I move up here and I click on the development module, I should get the exact raw pixels. And as you can see, when I toggle between these two, here's library, looks a little soft. Here's development, looks nice and tack sharp. So this image is really beautiful. I love it. Let's move on to the next one that looks almost identical. And as you can see right here, between these two nearly identical images, there is a hint of motion blur happening right here. So I probably just kind of flicked my wrist a little bit too much when I pressed the shutter button, and that big old telephoto lens reaching all the way out there got us a little bit of motion blur happening. So of these two images, this one is razor sharp. So let's zoom back out, hit the B key. Actually, I've already added this to the quick collection, so let's hit this again, add to quick collection. So of these two images, that first one was much sharper. So as we move along, we've got kind of more of a overly confident I am a model look. I don't know that that entirely fits the theme that we're doing here. We want kind of fun and friendly and accommodating and welcoming and wholesome. So this one might be a little bit too confident. And then our very last one, she's got a super fun, engaging smile. Anytime you can get your client smiling, this is a good thing, especially if you're shooting pictures of kids. Mothers love pictures of their kids smiling. So anytime you get that really nice smile, hit the B key, add that to the quick collection. All right, now let's back up a little bit. Let's go up to our quick collection. And as you can see, we have whittled down our 20 files into 8 finalists. I feel like this is a really nice selection of the metal chairs. So I'm gonna select all of these files and I'm gonna drag them into my quick collection folder that says Ashley Chair Final Cut. So that when we click here, we now have our final selects for the metal chairs. All right, at this point, we're ready to dive right into some Lightroom editing. So let's select our very first picture and jump into the development module and give this a look. Right now, I can tell there's not really a whole lot that we need to do to this file because again, we've been doing our best to shoot really, really brilliant images in camera. And the better you do on location, the less you have to do when you're here in post-production. There's nothing about this image that needs to be saved or brought back to life because we made some egregious mistake on location. This actually is a really great start. So let's get over to our sliders and start making some magic. I'm gonna bring the exposure up just a little bit. I'm gonna come in here and come in at 0.25. That's gonna kind of brighten the file up just a little bit. As you can see, it kind of looks to me like her skin tones have gotten a little bit too bright. So we're gonna grab this highlight slider and bring those back down just a tad. I also feel like there is an enormous amount of color saturation happening right here. This happens to be a very, very warm image. There were a number of buildings nearby that had bright orange red rock facades, and they were kind of pumping a little bit of extra red-orange light into the courtyard. So Ashley has a little bit of an orange glow to her. So let's go up into the color temperature slider and grab that, and let's bring it down just a little bit to knock out some of that super orange color that we're seeing. All right, very good. Next, we're gonna go down. I'm actually gonna bring my blacks and my shadows up just a little bit. As you can see, as if I bring those up, it kind of gives a little bit extra life to her hair. It actually has this very dark hair, and it tends to kind of blend into the dark background if we're not too careful. So my shadows and my blacks, we're gonna bring those up just a little bit so that I can keep a little bit of information in her hair. Moving down, for portraiture, I usually don't mess with vibrance and color saturation. The worst thing you can do is oversaturate your portrait. You don't want your skin tones looking like your person got nuked by a nuclear weapon. So I usually leave those at 0. And then later on when we get into Photoshop, I'll actually probably end up taking even a little bit more color out of her skin. So we come down to our tone curve. I don't know that we need a great deal here. I'm gonna add just a couple of points and make a little baby S curve. Go up on our highlights, up on our whites, down on our darks, and down on our shadows just a little bit. That's gonna kind of add a little tiny hint of contrast back into the image, which is gonna look really, really nice. Hue, color, saturation, and luminance. I don't know that we need to play with these panels all that much because again, it's a very well-balanced exposure to begin with. I think we're getting close to being done with this. As we come down to the bottom, we have a couple of checkboxes here. We can remove chromatic aberration and we can enable portrait corrections. When we click both of these on, let's see what we did here. All right, so the profile correction actually pulled some of the vignetting out of the sides of the image. When I toggle this back and forth, we need to make sure whether we like that edit or not. I think if I'm being perfectly honest, I like the original format to where the lens barrel is actually creating a little bit of a darker tone right here around here on the edges. So I'm going to leave that unchecked, and I'm also going to uncheck this chromatic aberration because it's not really seem to be doing a whole lot. All right, so that looks like a pretty good round of edits for our first image. As you can see, the sliders haven't moved a whole lot because, like I say, we've been doing our due diligence and we've been doing our best to shoot the absolute best work in camera. That will save you so much time in post-production if you start with really beautifully balanced raw files. So moving right along, let's edit a couple of these and then we'll get them exported over to Photoshop. So here we have our side profile image. You can see Ashley is sitting in the exact same place, exact same chair. Neither her nor the camera have moved, although we have created a drastically different image because now she's no longer paying attention to the viewer. This makes this a very candid and kind of a beautiful moment. I think I probably did shuffle around just a little bit because I can see if we move back to our first image, you can see the camera is taking a little bit of a higher angle. I can see behind her, here's the patio on the ground. And then if we move over to this next image, that patio is all the way down here, and I'm starting to see some of this fence in behind her. Now we've created a couple of these sort of blurred out background elements where the sunlight was hitting this sort of porch in the background here. And honestly, I kind of like that. I'm not normally a fan of big exposure burnouts in the background, but these aren't fully burned out. There actually is a fair amount of color information still in them, and to that degree, they don't really offend me that much. And once again, even though this is a raw file and raw files tend to be a little bit more flat and gray, I can see that there is just an enormous amount of color information going on in her face. And she does look a little orange, a little warm, a little bit yellow because there were lots of buildings around kind of pumping a great deal of yellow reflective light into the scene. So let's hop over into our development panel and take a look at what we can do. I think we're going to make a few sort of more localized edits for this image. I think that if I go in and I bring the exposure up like I did before, that'll give us a good start. That starts to release a little bit of the kind of the color information that's been hiding in the shadows. But obviously her face has gotten a little bit overexposed. You can see here her cheek is getting a little hot right around her chin here. It's a beautiful kind of rim light that we've created, but we don't want to overdo that. You don't want to create hot spots on people's skin. So let's grab our highlights tab. Let's move that down a little bit and bring her kind of back down into the human race just a little bit. That looks pretty good right there. Our whites, I'm actually going to bring those up just a tiny little tick. And then our shadows, I'm going to bring those up, and our blacks are going to come up just another little bit because, again, Ashley's hair is very dark and I don't want it completely disappearing into the scene. So speaking of hair, I think I want to bring a little bit more of her hair information out. So I'm going to grab the radial neutral density filter and I'm going to make kind of a large format sort of selection just generally around Ashley's hair. Let's get it right in there, and then we can lift the exposure up just a little bit more. As you can see, if we go too far, we get this weird looking sunny hot spot that's 3 stops above, but we're not gonna go that far. We're just gonna lift that hair up just enough so we can start to see some of these highlights in this beautiful hair. I'm gonna bring some highlights up and actually gonna contrast this out a little bit. I'll bring some shadows down just a tad, some blacks down, some whites up. So what we're doing is we're kind of boosting the highlights in her hair and we're darkening the shadows to build a little bit of contrast there. I think that looks pretty nice. All right, so let's close this filter back up. She does look a little orange to me, so I'm gonna knock a few points down on our color temperature, and that's gonna bring her skin tones a little bit back to a more manageable level. And at this point, I think this is starting to look pretty good. I'm seeing lots of warm color information in the back here, and I think we might want to go ahead and accentuate that. So I'm going to add another radial filter. I'm just going to kind of lift it back in here, and we're going to warm this section up, as you can see. It doesn't need to be that much, but I am seeing kind of warmer tones back here, and I kind of want to accentuate those a little bit. So those get a little extra color temperature. Maybe the exposure comes down just a little bit so it's not such a bright corner. Ease back on that, ease back on the highlights. We'll let the shadows and the blacks go down, give us some more contrast. That looks really good. And now that we've created this warm pocket in the back here, I feel like we might want to do a little bit the same to get some of this left side balanced. So let's grab another filter. We'll just kind of move it somewhere in this direction here. And I'll boost a little bit of color temperature and we'll bring the exposure down just a bit. Shadows, blacks. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now, when I look at this image overall, let's close this filter back up. When I look at this image overall, Ashley is still a little warm. I think her skin tones are a little bit too hot, but we're gonna save that edit for Photoshop. I don't wanna do too much in Lightroom right now. So as you can see, this is shaping up pretty nicely. We've brought a lot of really good colors out from our original raw file. Okay, moving right along. Let's grab our next image. I really like this image. So here Ashley is back to being engaging with the camera. If we hit our zoom tool, we can see that she is in fact nice and sharp right here on this closest eye to the viewer. So that's an acceptable amount of sharpness. That's actually really razor sharp on her eye, so that's good. She's got beautiful catch lights in her eyes. As a matter of fact, you can actually see me standing there in the distance taking a picture of her. There's a reflection of me in her eyes, so that's really cool. So let's back this back out. Once again, it looks like I've stood up a little bit taller. I've got a higher angle. I'm seeing less of this fence and less of this. This is probably more of a straight on angle. So not quite so high, not quite so low. I do like the way that this composition's turned out. She's making a very beautiful shape. You can see that her eyes are kind of in this sort of top left third of the tic-tac-toe board, as it were. So let's put a couple of edits onto this image. Once again, I'm seeing a little bit of red over here, and I want to kind of accentuate that and bring it out a little bit. So we'll start with our graduated neutral density filter, and I'm just going to bring that across here. And we're going to drop the exposure just a little bit to give us some nice kind of rich blacks in the back there, and I'm going to increase the color temperature. Look at that. It makes it kind of a little bit, add a little punch of red, kind of accentuate the warm tones that are already back there. And I feel like we probably want to try to balance that out a little bit. I'm going to put a circular neutral density filter up here in this corner. Get that in there. We'll punch that color temperature up just a little bit. So here's what we're working with over here. So we're going to punch that color temperature up just a little bit, and we'll throw maybe just drop that exposure just a tad, give it a couple of shadows, a little contrasty so it's kind of rich. All right, while we're making local edits and we have our circular neutral density tool open, let's give her hair a little bit of a boost. So without basically cracking into the entire overall exposure, I just want to create a more localized edit that's going to bring some of her hair up. So let's bring that exposure up just a little bit. That we start to see some highlights in there. We'll bring some highlights up, and then we'll drop our shadows and our blacks down just a tad, bring the whites up, and that's a nice little edit. Kind of brings her hair into the scene a little bit more. Now over here, we've got some unusual looking rim light kind of hitting Ashley's, the other side of Ashley's hair. I think this is actually quite beautiful. I didn't see any other images in this particular session to where this phenomenon was happening. So we had a series of trees that were providing shade from up above, and you can see where some of the light is pinching through these trees. She's got a beam of sunlight hitting her knuckle here, a little bit on her shirt, and it looks like we may have had a little bit of light kind of sneak in and hit the side of her hair, which was a happy accident. I didn't intend for that to happen, because typically we want to kind of tuck our subject into the full shade, but over here I think it really looks great. So let's add yet another one of these circular gradient tools, and we'll move this around a little bit, kind of keep it away from her face, and I'm just gonna warm that up. You can see just a little bit. We don't want her having red hair, but I want her to have a little bit warmer hair. Add a pinch of tint there. We'll lift that exposure up just a little bit. So this is too much, but this right in here is just right. And that kind of gives a really nice frame to her face. There's that beautiful, mysterious kind of red sunlight hitting the side of her hair. I think that's a nice edit, definitely. All right, let's close this panel. And we haven't even made any master adjustments just yet. We went straight into our local adjustments. So I'm gonna punch the exposure up just a little bit, maybe come up 0.2. The overall scene has definitely gotten brighter and more engaging, but her skin is starting to get a little hot. So again, let's grab our highlights, move that down just to where we start to see her skin come back to a normal tone. That looks good. I'll maybe bring her skin back up just a little bit with some basic whites in there. And I think for this one, that's starting to look really nice. I do love these little baby patches of sunlight that are escaping the tree and coming in on our scene. That's pretty unusual. You can't just create that in a studio the way that you get these magical happy accidents outside. So I'd say that's a pretty good edit. I'm actually looking forward to really kind of sinking our teeth into this image later on in Photoshop. All right, moving right along. Here we have yet another kind of smiling, engaging picture. This has got kind of a "hi mom, I love you" sort of a look to it. This image is similar enough to the previous image that I think we can probably just go over here and hit this previous button and have all of our edits from the last image filter over into this file. And we might have missed the mark just a little bit, so we're gonna take a look at our circular filters. You can see right here that this one is still more or less placed on her hair. I wanted to make sure that wasn't getting in on her face, because oftentimes, you know, if somebody moves around and then you do a synchronized settings, then your filters end up getting in somebody's face if they've moved. So that looks pretty good. We'll leave it kind of back there where her hair is. This one I don't think is doing anything because we've got green in the background. And if you remember, this filter was designed to warm that background up a little bit. So we're gonna just get rid of that and let the background go back to be a little bit more natural there. When we switch over to our graduated neutral density filter, we had one over here in this direction, and it was creating a nice sort of warm background. If I slide this all the way over, you can see how the red kind of comes up there. So we'll leave that right about where it was. And then I think for the most part, this image is similar enough to the previous one that I think it will work with those synchronized edits. So we're gonna move along. Let's grab our next one. This one is starting to feel a little bit more sultry. I think we've had some happy smiling stuff before that I feel like I'm a little bit happier about, because we want this to be engaging to the viewer. We don't necessarily need to be seducing the viewer. We need to be engaging the viewer with wholesome smiles. So I like this image. It's a great image. I can probably just hit the previous button. And okay, as you can see, this is a good example of how Ashley has moved around enough to where our localized edits are not going to work for this image. So right now we are in the graduated neutral density filter tool. This is starting to come into her face a little bit, so we're going to grab this and move it back a little bit so that it's not adding any extra warm color temperature onto her face. And then when we close this and move over into our circular neutral density filter, you can see right here, it's hit her right in the middle of the face. And this was designed to elevate the highlights in her hair and bring some of the exposure up in her hair. And now it's hitting her right in the face, so we don't want that. So we can just grab this and move it over here, change the angles up just a little bit so that it has maybe even a little bit of separation. And that looks pretty good. This one is actually warming up the backdrop right here. This is what we had on her the other side of her hair. I actually accidentally, it looks pretty cool to me right there. I think we can just leave that. That way she's got this nice little bright area on her left side, another bright little area on her right side, kind of boxing her in a little bit. So I'd say those are some pretty good edits. We'll close these down. The light on her face looks to be pretty good to me. It might be a tad hot, but that's something that we can easily kind of fine tune in Photoshop. So I'd say that's a pretty good edit here. All right, as we move along, this is the only image in the entire series where Ashley is actually looking in the other direction. Every other image, let's go back through these. Every other image, she is kind of moving off to the left side of the frame. Her face is sort of cheating off into that left side of the frame. That's to the left, that's to the left, that's to the left, mostly to the left, and finally she's off to the right. So we definitely want to keep this image. It's unique, it stands out amongst all the rest. It is smiley and flirty and engaging, so it doesn't have too much smolder for the seduction factor. I'm going to go ahead and hit the previous button because I think this is going to get us pretty close to the last one. And you can see our edits from the last file have come in and showed up here. Let's just go ahead and check our math a little bit. We'll start with these circular filters. So right here, this guy is kind of punching a little bit of brightness in on this side. This was originally meant to lift up the exposure of her hair a little bit. We can just kind of adjust that ever so slightly. The main thing is I don't want it on the middle of her face because that's not a correct edit. Down here, this is actually was meant to warm up the hair on the other side of her face, and you can see that same nice warm orange light coming in on the side of her hair. Ashley has very dark hair. She does not have orange or red hair, so this is all light that's painting the side of her head, and I think it looks really cool. So let's move this guy up a little bit here, and we'll allow this to kind of affect this hair on this side. Now this is a little bit too bright. That's getting sort of distracting. So I'm gonna move it slightly off and I'm gonna take our exposure power down quite a bit, almost to where it's non-existent, but just enough to where we're getting a little bit of extra punch out of that side. Okay, our graduated neutral density filter is still tucked over here to one side. It's not affecting her face. So all in all, I'd say this is a pretty good edit as well. Moving along, we have a little bit of a wardrobe change. I like this image because it's nice and engaging. The composition is, for the most part, the same as the rest of the images that we've done, although I do think I would change the crop on this image quite a bit. She's kind of centered in the image and she's not really filling the entire frame. So the first thing we're gonna do is grab our crop tool. I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna kind of just situate her eyes a little bit more in that top section of our rule of thirds grid. So when I hit the return key, that brings her in a little tighter. I feel like that looks quite a bit better. Now the light kind of softened up on us a little bit. It's not as harsh. There aren't quite as many of these fun little sunbeams clipping in on us right now. Her hand is starting to get a little hot on the exposure side, so I think the first place that I go, first we'll bring our entire exposure up just a little bit. Let's go 1/4. And then our highlights are definitely starting to get a little close to clipping now, so let's bring them back down. You can see her hand coming back to life, her face is coming back down to normal human levels. In this case, I'm actually going to take my shadows down and my blacks down a little bit because the light is so much softer. Her hair is not being kind of plunged into dark shadows like it was in the more contrasty images that we saw earlier. So that looks pretty good to me. Honestly, I think I might have made her face just a little too dark. So let's go back into our overall exposure. I'll go to 0.35. That should brighten us up just a little bit. And I'm going to drop into the whites here and bring them up just a couple of points just to bring her skin tones back up just a little bit. All right, that's a good edit. And then when we come into our final file, once again, if you capture a nice, beautiful, smiling image, that's kind of a gold mine, you know, especially mothers for their kids or parents, they love to see the kids smiling. So a good smiling picture is definitely worth its weight in gold. We're still a little bit too far back. I think I'm gonna do a little bit of a crop, but since this image is so similar to the one previous, almost identical composition, let's jump in here and we'll hit the previous button and we'll affect all of those changes from the last image. Now we have cropped in a little too tight because our previous image, the lens was dialed back a little bit farther. So let's go into our crop module here and give Ashley a little bit of breathing room so she pretty much fills the entire frame. We've got her eye situated in that nice rule of thirds section right there. So we'll leave that as it is, hit the enter key, and we are good to go. All right, let's pop back into our library view. We can see our thumbnails. I like all the edits that we've done. As you can see, we have smashed our way through a bunch of raw photo edits in Lightroom. It's quick, it's easy, you get great results. Let's go back through and take one last little look at our final selects. So starting here, moving along, a nice little change up there, a very spiritual prayer. Moving along, this is our beautiful engaging shot. We'll definitely be working on this one in Photoshop. Here's a nice cute little smile, flirty, leaning on the hands. This is a little bit more sultry. It probably won't make our super duper final cuts because again, these images, I feel like the theme that we've been bringing to the table is a little bit more kind of fun and wholesome. This one is a little bit more sultry and smoldery and seductive. Moving right along, this is a fun, engaging smile, and it does differentiate itself from the rest of the images, so I like that for sure. And here we go with a quick wardrobe change. This is a basic image. I'm not overly blown away by this shot. It's okay. And then finally, we did hit kind of a golden smile, so that looks pretty nice. All right, all in all, those are going to be our Lightroom edits. Like I said, we did our best to create beautiful images in camera, and so most of our Lightroom work was very subtle. We didn't have to go very far on any one of those sliders. We didn't have to recoup any major exposure disparities. Our work was very, very subtle and therefore quite easy for that matter. So let's select all of these images, and I'm going to export them into our Photoshop documents. Let's give them a name. This is Ashley and the metal chairs. Call these finals. Let's give these images a place to go. I'm going to choose from my desktop Ashley, Manitou, and they're going into the Photoshop documents section. So we'll choose their destination. We will give them a file name right there, and we're going to give them a format. They're going to be Photoshop documents, Adobe 1998 to preserve as much color space as possible. Again, I tend to get in trouble in this section right here. Most photographers are going to say you have to export in 16-bit color to give you access to all the color information. If we were doing a big ticket landscape file that maybe had perfectly blue skies and we had to have perfectly blue gradients in the sky, that's where your 16-bit color comes into play. We actually have a lot of contrast and a lot of movement in these images, and I fully believe that 8-bit color is more than adequate to get everything we need done. So against most people's better judgment, I'm going to stick with 8 bits. I feel like there's more than adequate information with 8-bit color space, and it's going to make drastically smaller files. Those 16-bit files are just absolute monsters. The 8-bit files are actually pretty big themselves, as we'll see when we jump into Photoshop. Again, I'm going to leave the resizing off. Lightroom defaults to the full-size image, and we've got monster images coming out of this Canon 5DSR. It's a 50 megapixel body, and it still produces beautiful images, even though it is an old camera. So with all of our export settings ready to go, let's hit the export button. These images will now move into the next phase of editing, which is Photoshop. So in the next lesson, we will pop a couple of these babies open in Photoshop. We'll do a little bit of frequency separation. We'll get those skin tones dialed in perfectly. We'll retouch, and the images will be absolutely perfect. So we'll see you in the next lesson.